Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is your host, Kushalmehra. My guest today is Caryma Sa'd. Now, let's give you guys a little bit of a background or how I met Caryma. So, as you know, Justin Trudeau, he has been. I'm actually very thankful to Justin Trudeau and his gaffes because in the recent India Canada kerfuffle, a lot of Canadians and Indians have started meeting on Twitter Spaces. So, in one of these Twitter Spaces is where I came across Caryma, and she discussed this very interesting topic of what is the title of today's podcast, which is #Hategate. And I was like, damn, I need to know more about this. And then I messaged Caryma on the Twitter DM, and she was nice enough to agree to come on the podcast. So, Caryma, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Caryma, this is your first time on the podcast. So, for the benefit of my viewers and listeners, because this is going to go on the audio version too, can you tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Caryma. I am a lawyer and journalist based in Toronto, Canada. I focus in my law practice mostly on housing, cannabis, and criminal law issues. And the journalism came about initially as a passion project and something that I've leaned more into as time went on. But it started with the pandemic and protests that were happening across Canada. And I wanted to know more about why people were taking to the streets, what issues they had, how those were being articulated, what was motivating. And that's been quite the journey. So I spent time documenting the Freedom Convoy that took place in, I guess, January, February of 2022. And that resulted in the Emergencies Act being invoked for the first time in Canadian history. And that's because apart from the streets in Ottawa being taken over by large trucks and the protesters surrounding that, there were border blockades. There was allegedly a weapons cache retrieved at one of these. And so a lot of dissent and turmoil in the nation. And that kind of journey has carried on as protests continue, the subjects change a little bit, and gender ideology has been a huge point of contention lately. And, I'm interested in what I've now termed Canada's hate industrial complex, because there's a lot of money that goes into the amorphous, abstract notion of hate, which itself is used to justify suppression of speech or shutting down events. And I think that it's not a particularly academic or legally based approach. So my personal positionality throughout this has evolved, changed, but I've always been an observer, and at times drawn into it as sort of a character in almost a gonzo style journalism, because despite being a huge landmass, Canada is ultimately a fairly small country. So you keep coming across the same individuals, the same politicians, and that's what brings me here today.
So I like this word that you've used, the hate industrial complex, because now I've the first time I came in my life to this country, Canada, was in the year 2001 when I was studying in York University. And I clearly remember that, look, I mean, I've traveled around the world. I don't know how to say this, but I'm going to say this in the most non-targeted way towards white people as possible. I mean, I'm not trying to say this in a racist way. I'm trying to say this in a positive way. Like, I've come across a lot of white people in my life. I've been to UK, I've been to America, I've been to Western Europe. I have a lot of white friends. But there is something unique about the Canadian white folks. They have taken in the burden of all white folks on this planet. And they have taken that burden and they have charged themselves with on a steroids version of it of some sort. And they And I used to always find them to be so guilt ridden about everything. I'm like, well, why are you bothered about something that happened in America or the United Kingdom? And this hate industrial complex that you're talking about, is a lot of it comes from that white guilt in Canada. And it's to me, at times, I used to find it condescending as a brown man, to be very honest. I used to find it extremely condescending. And I hope you can understand where I'm coming from, because everything is not about you guys. I mean, I just want to put it out there. Everything is not about, whether it's guilt or whether it's racism. You can't be equally good or equally bad at the same time. And it used to bother me a lot. And I would just shut up, because I was a student. I did not understand it that then, but I used to observe these patterns. And over the years, I have seen this really grow as American soft power is real. And because America has changed, and victimhood epistemology is now the essence of America. And whatever happens in America, Canada does the steroids version of that. This has been my outsider observation as an Indian who looks at both America and Canada. So do you think America has a role in playing a role on the Canadian psyche in the eight industrial complex?
I think that's probably fair to say to some degree. It's funny. I would almost think that we're a watered down version as opposed to on steroids, but I'm here in the center of it, so it's hard to tell from the eye of the hurricane. The way that race is dealt with in Canada, and I think this has to do with sort of a cultural wanting to be perceived as nice, wanting to be perceived as the good guys.
Yes.
And that doesn't necessarily mean being nice or being a good guy. It's more about the appearance, right? And that's been my observation as a very visible minority who gets targeted quite frequently by white people who are ostensibly progressive, but will marshal all of their energy and animosity toward me for saying things they don't like or that make them feel uncomfortable rather than tackling systemic issues. So there's a very shallow analysis, I would say, where people get caught up in the trappings or the window dressing, and an unwillingness to engage with the rot underneath, quite frankly. Now, the hate industrial complex in Canada, in its most recent form and iteration, has direct ties to what's happening in the United States. For example, the Southern Poverty Law Center provided seed money, $25,000, to the Canadian Anti-Hate Network, which is the closest thing we have to a Northern equivalent. So there are connections between what's happening south of the border and here, but we being Canadians, uniquely make it our own, in sort of this sugary sweet kind of way that is quite artificial.
Yeah, actually, you couldn't have explained it in a better way, the Canadian way. This is just it is such a passive aggressive way of doing things in Canada. In America, when you face hostility in America, it's very in your face. Like, I've lived in both the countries. If an American is hostile to you, they're just hostile to you. They'll just say it to your face. But in Canada, it's like, they'll butter you up like a slice of bread, and they keep on putting that butter, and then they'll say, it's almost as if in a nice way, you're such a jackass. It's even more irritating.
Yeah, and I get flack sometimes because sometimes, like, the way that I approach documenting protests and rallies on the ground, there I am a little bit in your face. And that it makes people bristle at times and it feels foreign, but actually it's just an attempt to be direct. And that directness, it doesn't always jive well with how Canadians want to present themselves or be perceived.
Yeah, the most condescending comment I personally heard from a random Canadian once in 2002 was, "You're too aggressive for an Indian." I did not know how to take it then, and I remember it to this day. So the image of Indians was supposed to be, docile, Mahatma Gandhi. I am the apostle of non-violence. I don't
Mhm.
do anything. And York University had a huge Gandhi statue. Apparently every Indian is supposed to go and pray to Gandhi every day. I guess I don't know if they still have the Gandhi statue in York University. When I used to study, it used to have a giant Gandhi statue at
I
York
know that
University.
there's one at Carleton University, so maybe this is across university campuses in Canada. I didn't know about the York one. I'll look into that.
Yeah. So now for the benefit of Indians, because a good 70% of this podcast, like I do have a huge Canadian listener base, which is very unlike Indian podcasters. I don't know why I do, but apparently I built a listener base in Canada and America. I'm one of those unique Indian podcasters who has like 30 to 35% of his listener base is outside India, which is very weird. I've never figured it out why it is the case with me. But for my Indian listeners, especially, I want you now to explain #Hategate in a detailed manner, not in a curtailed manner.
Okay. I will do my best to make it make sense for those who aren't finger on the pulse of Canadian politics. So earlier, I referenced the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa that took place early 2022. And that was an event of national significance because basically our capital was shut down, border crossings from coast to coast were affected. There was this widespread dissent in the streets. And, you know, on a prima facie level, it was about mandates and the introduction of vaccine mandates for truckers. And I think that there are some people who genuinely that was their primary purpose for being there, but it had the appearance, at least, of a grassroots movement where lots of different grievances motivated people to be out there. So some relating to mandates more generally, their own employment, unrelated to the trucking industry being affected, the impact on their family lives, the impact of lockdowns. And there was also a very strong anti-Trudeau sentiment across the board. And I would say that above anything else was what unified protesters, the disdain for Justin Trudeau. And the way that this unfolded, particularly in Ottawa, I was there from day one. It was interesting because police initially welcomed the trucks. They told people where to park. It was jovial, it was amicable, it was friendly. Police relations for at least the first couple of weeks seemed largely supportive almost of this protest. And there are dynamics to unpack there as far as what was happening within the Ottawa Police Service and a chief who did not have the support of his officers. But in any event, at a certain point, the federal government said enough is enough. We need to deal with this. And they took a fairly heavy-handed approach, which was to invoke the Emergencies Act. And this was the first time the legislation was used in Canadian history. It basically, it's not quite martial law, but it gave additional powers to the federal government that otherwise wouldn't have been available. An interesting little tidbit is that the predecessor legislation, the War Measures Act, was most recently invoked by Justin Trudeau's father in the 1970s. So just kind of a unrelated, but a fun trivia fact, I think. And so the basis for the Emergencies Act, there was a commission after the fact, which is mandatory in the legislation, and different perspectives, viewpoints, a lot of testimony provided. Ultimately, it was found that the invocation of the act was justified. Now, Hategate is about what happened and what led to the Emergencies Act in a very, very narrow sense. So there is a man named Jeremy Mackenzie, who is a Canadian podcaster, a combat war veteran, kind of a loudmouth, definitely not appealing to everyone, and a bit subversive in some of his podcasting. And others would say offensive, racist, so on and so forth. But he's someone who did not, let's say, hold the government in high regard. And his views were aligned with what the Freedom Convoy came to represent. And Jeremy Mackenzie was, I would say, not the main or a determinative reason for the Emergencies Act being invoked. That would be an overstatement of his importance. But he does have a podcast fan base, which he refers to as Diagolon. And Diagolon, in Canadian media and then law enforcement reports and statements from government officials, was portrayed as being a right-wing extremist accelerationist militia. So an actual militia, as opposed to people who tune in, listen, may agree with his views, but aren't actually organized in any meaningful sense to try and take over the country or create their own country. The notion of Diagolon itself it came about because geographically, from Alaska down to Florida, there's a diagonal line of states and provinces whose approach to COVID-19 public health measures differed from anyone on either side of it. So they were generally resistant to lockdowns, mandates, so on and so forth. And, that was jokingly taken to be, well, these guys should be their own country and everyone else can be around it. But it was at all material times quite evidently a joke. The project Hategate, it stems from a Freedom of Information request that was made looking for what the RCMP knew about Diagolon in the year where the Freedom Convoy happened, leading up to it and after the fact. And the reason that we sort of put it together, I co-authored this document with a woman named Elisa Hategate. We went through over 1,000 pages of these Freedom of Information documents, and were able to conclude that actually the RCMP, our Royal Canadian Mounted Police, they knew that it wasn't really an extremist group. They knew that it wasn't really a militia, despite sort of what was being portrayed publicly. And at the time that the Emergencies Act was invoked, you can imagine there was quite a frenzy within the population, among lawmakers, senators, and the boogeyman of Diagolon kept coming up as a reason, as an existential threat that needs to be addressed. And it just simply wasn't, there was nothing underlying that based in reality. And, I can only imagine, and this is going to be the subject of another Freedom of Information request, what resources were spent on studying, monitoring, keeping tabs on this podcast fan base, and the impact that it had on some of the individuals who, particularly Jeremy Mackenzie, who were the face of it without really, being the leader of an organization per se. And I would say the key point to take away from all of this is that the reason Jeremy Mackenzie and Diagolon were initially characterized as a militia has to do with the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. So this is a non-governmental organization with, ties to the federal government, and they steadily, for many, many months, portrayed Jeremy Mackenzie and Diagolon as a far right, dangerous threat. Their assessment was repeated by media outlets, treating them as the sole expert source. Then law enforcement relied on media outlets to shore up their own research. Government officials then relied on these law enforcement reports that are citing media, that are citing the anti-hate network, but there's no triangulation of data. There's nothing, no real investigation. And despite Jeremy Mackenzie repeatedly offering to speak with law enforcement, that never happened. So it's this feedback loop, this copy paste journalism, copy paste police investigations that, you know, created a false perception that really ingrained itself in Canada's public consciousness at the expense of an individual citizen whose only crime maybe was being distasteful online. And you know, that it goes to the heart of expression and the way that the government deals with dissent, and it ties into this hate industrial complex, because the primary smear that was used is these people are hateful, they're racist, they're bigots, so on and so forth. And that in itself was enough almost to elevate it even past the threshold of criminality, despite there never being charges for sedition or terrorism or criminal conspiracy or anything you might expect to see if there was an actual threat to national security. So in my view, the real threat to national security is this lazy, complacent approach that we see across institutions, media, government, law enforcement, that allowed this to take root.
No, this is very relatable. And you might be like, that's such a terrible thing to relate to, but it is actually. Indians and Canadians have a lot of things they can relate to. One of the things is the authoritarian impulse inside our political systems, whether it's Canada or in India. I have noticed this authoritarian impulse. So let me narrate a story for you from India's political past. And believe me, this was a blot on Indian society that every Indian, you know, especially I want to narrate this because a lot of, like, 30% of this podcast is kids under the age of 25. Kids, well, I am 42, so I mean I'm too old now. So there you go, people. But uh, in on June 25th, there was something that had happened, which was called the emergency. It was in 1975, where the then Prime Minister of India, Indira Gandhi, had invoked Articles 352 and 356 of the Indian Constitution. Now, for people who want to talk about Article 352, it is basically, and I'm reading the article verbatim, it is an emergency due to war, external aggression, or armed rebellion. This is known as a national emergency. And Article 356 is basically emergency due to the failure of the constitutional machinery in the states. This is more like a precedence rule in India. These are two articles that are used consistently in the emergency story. And it all starts with the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi losing an election, challenging it in the court, and then the court verdict came on June 12th. This is the famous Allahabad High Court. Allahabad is a city in a province in northern India called Uttar Pradesh. And they basically, the verdict was against Indira Gandhi and in favor of the person who defeated her. And then, to deal with this situation, Indira Gandhi imposed the emergency, where I think almost all of the opposition was jailed in India. All of the opposition, everybody was jailed. So I know, and even today, as of now in India, we have many draconian laws on our books, whether it is on the subject of sedition, like Article 124 or 295A. We have a blasphemy law in India where you cannot hurt religious sentiments. This is thanks to the Britishers. When the Britishers enacted this law in the 1920s, and even after independence, the Indians were like, "We'll keep this rubbish," and we have it on our books. There is disturbance of public order 153A, and there are many pathetic laws that exist on the Indian statute books. There is an IT law, and it just, the list is go just non-stop. When I was reading this material that you shared with me to go through, I was like, damn, this is so eeringly similar. And the motive and the modus operandi is the same every time. Oh, our country cannot handle this. These people will run our old system to the ground. Fear mongering. Then how do you justify the fear mongering? I don't know how else to say this, but you find friendly media outlets. Friendly media outlets that repeat and regurgitate everything that the state apparatus wants you to regurgitate. It is literally cut, copy, paste journalism where they are questioning, they're supposed to question what the government is doing when it is actually taking their powers away, but the complete opposite happens. The media completely complies. I mean, there were income tax raids in 1970s against Bollywood stars who opposed the emergency of Indira Gandhi, at that time the then prime minister. There were people who were heckled for years on because they opposed the emergency. Now I lay this to you so that you understand. I can actually relate to this, and many of my Indian friends and listeners, they can relate to what you're saying. But we never thought something as dastardly as this would happen in the West. The famous American line, freedom and democracy. They just go around yapping about freedom and democracy to everyone. So we never thought this would happen in the West. But how bad was this Emergencies Act in terms of its impact on individual people?
So it was relatively short-lived. It wasn't the period that it was invoked. It wasn't that long. We did see violence in the streets in Ottawa and elsewhere. There were protests where police, who up to that point had taken a fairly hands-off approach, suddenly were instructed or empowered to use more force. It is still probably relatively mild compared to what we see in other countries, but people reported injuries, being pepper sprayed, being kicked, hit with guns, that kind of thing. No deaths, thankfully. Other impacts, people were debanked, and that's an issue that persists. Where, yes, I see your expression. It is quite concerning. People who were not found guilty of any criminal offense, or may not even have had allegations of criminality, were no longer able to access their bank accounts. Those bank accounts were closed or frozen. That it is an issue that persists, where it's very difficult for people to function without a working bank account. And so it's a means of cutting someone off without, in a sort of insidious kind of way. And there's not a lot of due process, if we put it that way, because your rights of appeal are fairly limited. So that's kind of that's how I would characterize the emerge. It was obviously enough as well to compel tow truck companies to start removing some of the large machinery that had stationed itself in Ottawa. So that's that's how it unfolded, the Emergencies Act here.
Yeah, but I mean, how does a libertarian deal with this? Because I have very strong libertarian leanings on many subjects, although I am more of a lapsed libertarian now. I understand the value of the state in many ways, but This is what, like, even a libertarian does not know how to deal with this. Like, if a private bank is just going to debank you, like,
Mhm.
where do you go then? Where you go the old school way, dealing in cash, going around.
And there are so many things, ironically, in part due to the pandemic, where just in daily life, Canada has moved steps towards becoming a more cashless society. So, it can't be understated the impact that not having a bank account has on someone. And that's, it's a social impact, but a very real one that it affects their ability to even receive a paycheck.
All right. So there were accusations when I started digging up on Hategate, because listen, I did not know about this at all. And when I came across your work, I started doing some digging, and it's my duty to ask this question. Uh, a lot of people who have spoken about Hategate, they have been accused of being white supremacists. So how much of a white supremacist are you as a brown person?
I can say that, it's such an absurd, and that's not to say that someone can be brown or black or whatever, and not actively or unintentionally uphold systems of white supremacy. Personally, I don't fall into that category. By my own assessment of my work, the ways that I critique people and institutions, it just doesn't jive. But it's a very convenient label to affix in order to get people to disregard the entirety of what's being said. And the reason I think that the label comes about, there's a couple of things. First, I mentioned that the actual substance of Jeremy Mackenzie's podcast, it's not for everyone's sensibilities, and there are episodes or statements or people who tune in or chime in or who are affiliated either loosely or more closely, whose views are arguably racist, right? And that is not the same thing. And I think there's a lack of appreciation for this. It's not the same thing as propagating hate speech. There's actually quite a high threshold in Canadian criminal law surrounding the incitement of hatred. It is not just words that are hateful. There are elements to that offense. And it also misses the point because the substance of the podcast, Mackenzie's podcast, is not the point of Hategate. The point is that we have a civilian who was targeted by an ostensibly civilian NGO, and then the media, government, law enforcement apparatus took that analysis and made it out to be a militia. And so the question is this podcast fan base a militia? And I think we can definitively say, no, it is not. So if we want to assess whether, the substance of the podcast is white supremacist or inappropriate or offensive or hateful or hurtful, that's a separate analysis to undertake. It was not within the scope of what we produced in this report. And to say that it's white supremacy to raise the actual issues that we raised and the patterns that exist, I think is very short-sighted, because it ultimately, this is about the state versus civilians and the power that is exercised by the state against civilians. And it's a lot easier to overlook that when it happens to someone who is wildly unpopular. There's an element of, well, they had it coming, they deserved it, they said this, so who cares what happens to them? But that's precisely where the erosion of civil liberties and expression and our constitutional rights happens, when we normalize these measures that are disproportionate, don't relate to reality on the ground, and we justify it because it's for the greater good. It's not for the greater good to undermine the Constitution or our basic civil liberties ever.
Yeah, and just to add to this, listen, I'm someone who's vaccinated. I even got a single booster shot, which was required by law in India. I mean, I did it. I'm someone who thinks the vaccine is if efficient enough, but at the same time, I'm someone who says if somebody does not want to get the vaccine, I don't care. Don't get it, man. Just and I think COVID really short circuited some people on either side, huh? Whether it's the anti-vaccination side or the pro-vaccination on steroids version side. Like, I'm very pro-vaccine. Most Indians you will come across are by and large pro-vaccine. You're like, the anti-vaxxers in India are not that famous. They're just not. I find this anti-vaccine tirade in America, and before people make it sound as if the anti-vaccine tirade in America is a right-wing phenomenon, no, ladies and gentlemen, go and check out the first anti-vaxxers of America. They are all highly left-wing, progressive California folks who, and in the most progressive county of California in 2014-15, and you have the famous cases of Jenny McCarthy, Jim Carrey, and many others. Jim Carrey is a Canadian, by the way, for people who don't know. Originally, Jim Carrey is a Canadian who now lives in America, and it's a very unique thing. And I used to find it very absurd how divided the entire issue is in the United States of America, and I feel at times in Canada too. But it doesn't mean that if somebody doesn't want to take a vaccine, they are some white supremacists. And secondly, even if they are a white supremacist, let's assume they are a white supremacist. Okay, I grant you that. Let them be. Who cares? Like, this is coming from me, a brown guy. Like, who
Yeah.
cares?
Yeah, there is so much to unpack in that, and I agree largely with what you've said. The polarization that exists and is increasingly entrenched in Canadian society has a lot to do with this short circuiting, or people taking mental shortcuts, and kind of our brains are almost SEO optimized, where you hear the key word, and without additional inputs or information, you're able to make this assessment about another human being whose views are probably a patchwork of opinions, just like all of us. And within the far left in Canada, and I hesitate to even call it far left. This binary is somewhat false. It's maybe more accurate to say the authoritarian left. There's this expectation that everyone's opinions are in perfect lockstep at any given moment. And if your opinions do not match, then you are to be ostracized because you don't meet this sort of purity standard. And so that self-cannibalization on the left means that folks who took opinions that, I'm okay with other people not getting vaccinated, or I personally don't want to get vaccinated, became lumped in with Nazis and white supremacists. And it is a very unhelpful, unproductive way of dealing with different opinions in society. And simultaneously, so along with this expulsion, if you don't match our views, and you're therefore fair game to be targeted in ways that and I blame online for this a little bit, but there's a dehumanization that occurs where if you are no longer with us, then anything is fair game against you. There's simultaneously this train of thought where we must suppress. So it's not enough to ostracize; they must also be suppressed. And this, whether it's framed in terms of deplatforming or just attacking the ability to speak or debate, I find so anti-progressive, because people are allowed to have wrong opinions, bad opinions, and I'm of the view that the cure for bad speech is better speech, as opposed to trying to shut something down, driving it further underground, making it more appealing in some ways. And the way that this authoritarian left has gone about um, pushing people into the arms of who they say are the problem source, right? Because if someone is alienated, it's a natural instinct to try and find a new community and new support, and that is what, in my view, pushes some people to extremism. And I've watched it happen in real time, by attending these rallies. I've seen it in all directions. I've seen people become more involved in the movement, more radical, more extreme. I've seen people step away, drop out. And so, I have at least an anecdotal perspective on how these pipelines work. And just it's so counterproductive to the stated goals. And yet there's no tolerance for any disagreement with how it's unfolding. And that's what happened to me. I'm fairly left of center in most of my views. And I was, or they tried to cancel me, for wanting to speak with someone who is the polar opposite and is, more radical on the side of the right. And I wanted to have an interview in the context of a comedy show, which was my chosen form of political expression. And it was literally blockaded. And I was then blamed for a fight that transpired in the streets because of uninvited thugs who showed up to fight other uninvited thugs, and that was all my fault somehow. So I digressed a little bit, but the polarization isn't going to be resolved if we continue to rely on these mental shortcuts, because it there's no real thought or analysis, and we stop seeing each other as complex human beings, and we become these two-dimensional creatures that need to be shut down, and that's such a dangerous perspective.
Yeah, I can relate to what you're saying because I'm someone who has many views that might be called left wing, and I'm a man who's very clearly on the right. I've never hidden that. I don't hide that. I mean, for context, India does not have a right wing, guys. India, everybody is on the left. Just for the record, people call BJP right wing. They're not. They sometimes people should read a little. I always say this to my friends in the West. It would do you good if you read policies. The like BJP, the right wing party of India, increased the abortion limit. BJP, the right wing party of India, introduced a bill, the transgender protection bill in 2019, and then they actually gave a definition of what transgender is in detail. So people don't understand each other's politics, and this stems from, you're very right, social media has incentivized human beings to opine a lot more. We're not supposed to have so many opinions. W- we're not. Honestly, we just have too many opinions. I'm saying
Yes.
everybody's going out there and dropping opinion bombs as if it makes sense. Nothing makes sense, you idiots. Most of it is gobbledygook. So we should not opine a lot, but social media, unfortunately, uh, incentivizes over opinionating, and in that process people end up having a lot of mediocre opinions. Like recently I did this, I tweeted that if we did uh, an analysis of a lot of these social political commentators, which includes me, by the way, before people think, and we did a fact check on how many opinions we gave in the form of analysis and how many ended up being right, we would understand how full of shit we all are. And I say this with full responsibility on
Hmm.
my own podcast. At least I'm
Hmm.
aware of how full of shit I am, right? But and it breeds, the social media breeds this absurd sort of narcissism in people, where the entire world is supposed to fall on their feet. And coupled to that, we have this phenomenon where localized events are internationalized now. Now, you know, there might be something happening in Brampton, and in a corner of Brampton. But people in India will be like, there are guns firing everywhere in Canada, as the Punjabis like to call Canada, Canada, and everywhere it is unsafe in Canada, and vice versa. There might be someone seeing an unfortunate incident with a Hindu or a Muslim in India, and they'll be like, there are hate factories, and and you are true, we have weaponized hate. We think hate gets us clicks, and in this incessant obsession with it, we have gone from bad to worse. And anybody who comes and questions this, like a person like me, I am a very skeptical person when it comes to grandiose claims. But I want to talk to you about one specific thing here, because again, I have many libertarian leanings and I hate the government in many ways. When I read the role of the RCMP in this entire scenario that you documented, okay, that scared the living daylights out of me. Now tell us about that, because that was very scary for an Indian.
So the RCMP is Canada's federal police, um, and they have jurisdiction across provinces on federal matters, and in some provinces where there's no local police force, the RCMP has detachments and they do sort of the work there. The RCMP was, in my view, a driving force behind this misrepresentation of Diagolon as an extremist group. And I'll give an example of one specific incident that transpired. Our public safety minister went on television and made very sweeping remarks about this weapons cache that was uncovered in Alberta, saying that there are close ties, or there's a clear connection with organizers who are in Ottawa. And the reporters at the time, they pressed a little bit to understand, what organization, what connections, what are you talking about? Does that mean there's weapons in Ottawa? And he kept saying, deferring to the RCMP, or just ask law enforcement for the answers. And so we uncover in the Freedom of Information documents this chain of emails where RCMP officers are being asked to clarify the minister's statements, and they don't have anything to go on. And so what they ended up doing was finding a news article that connected this weapons cache because of a homemade patch that matches the Diagolon logo. And they said, well, there's these patches, and so that's that's why. And yes, so they bolster his statements after the fact by quoting media back to the media, and this very circular, it was shocking because it's backward and it's not information finding. It's kind of plastering it after the fact, like paper mache over a nugget of nothing. And throughout these FOI documents as well, you have officers who were apparently tasked with listening to Mackenzie's podcast, and they're taking excerpts of things that sound potentially scary. But if you listen to the episode in context, it's very clear that in surveilling, they aren't actually plugged into this internet culture. And it's akin to, someone stepping into a Dungeons and Dragons game and not appreciating that this is, a separate, like a little subculture, and thinking that there's, actual battle plans being made, or there's dragons coming, or whatever. So just this disconnect that they were either unaware of is the best interpretation, because the alternative means they knew but pushed forward regardless. And one thing that I will highlight is the RCMP has, at best, a checkered history in Canada. Originally, it was formed, as part of the way that the government handled Indigenous people. And so having sort of a reserve system, a pass system, residential schools. The RCMP was enforcing all of that. And these now we can appreciate were gross violations of human rights. The RCMP was involved in a barn burning, an arson that they tried framing on activists in the 1970s. And that's how CSIS came to exist. It was an offshoot of the RCMP because RCMP can no longer be trusted exclusively to handle national security issues. And just most recently, and this ties into Jeremy Mackenzie, in Nova Scotia, the province of Nova Scotia, there was a mass shooter who, for 2 days or so, was able to roam around uncaught, undetected. Communications between RCMP and the public were misleading, shoddy. The aftermath, where reporting, it was a botched operation at best. And Jeremy Mackenzie was very vocal about this, and his conclusions that he reached were ultimately, many of them were affirmed by the Mass Casualty Commission, which independently assessed what happened and said the RCMP screwed up massively in these different ways. And so Jeremy Mackenzie, and this tracks with sort of when he seems to be on the RCMP radar. It connects to him publishing this viral podcast that humiliates the RCMP. And suddenly he is a person of interest without having done anything that really warrants it. And I should add, actually, that Mackenzie is facing, or was facing, different sets of charges laid by the RCMP across 3 different provinces in Canada. Several of those charges have been withdrawn, and the ones that are pending, he intends to fight. So we'll see how it plays out. But there are irregularities even in the way that he was taken from Nova Scotia, 3,000 kilometers to Saskatchewan for a mischief and assault charge without ever having a proper opportunity to surrender himself or turn himself in. So, when you say that this scares you, it is scary because it raises a lot of questions about the use and abuse of power, and the law enforcement targeting civilians for reasons that are wholly inappropriate and have to do with political expression.
Oh my God, this sounds so much like what happened what happens in India. This is so eerily, like I said, the authoritarian impulse. Uh, no wonder Canada is one country I always could relate to.
And we do a fairly good job of masking it a lot of the time.
Yeah,
I should say that the fact that we're able to obtain these freedom of information documents, that itself is a positive thing, because I can imagine circumstances where it's just, we put this through the shredder, no one's ever going to see it, right? So there are hopes for maintaining democracy, or at least pushing toward it, because it's never been perfect and it never will be. But the more complacent people are about what's going on, the easier it becomes for this to be a pattern, right?
yeah, and for people who don't know what you're talking about, the Freedom of Information Act is the Indian version of that is the Right to Information Act, RTI, guys, Indian people. So what she's talking about is we have something similar like that in RTI. So this is the RTI version of Canada that that Caryma is talking about. But you know, when I hear all of this, I just as an Indian, like, I can understand every lever that's being pushed over here. How the state is used to suppress people who speak, and not even willing to disagree with the left wing argument that there might be white supremacists hiding somewhere. My answer is, so what? I mean, why do you have such a low opinion of your society? Why do you have such a low opinion about your own people that you can't even handle a fringe group in society? I mean, India, we have active separatist movements inside India. Some of them we have exported to Canada too, by the way. Some of them who live in Surrey and Brampton. And I don't see the RCMP and the Canadian governments going hammer and tongs on them, where they call for assassinations of Indian diplomats in Canada in big posters. But I guess, you can go the whole hog when it's a white person involved. I guess that's all I can say.
It there's a shift, right? Because from 2001 up until, let's say, 2016, the boogeyman or the scapegoat was Muslims or anyone who was appearing brown, right? So you didn't actually have to be Muslim. It was enough to be any semblance of Middle Eastern or olive skin, right? As much as Canada wants to pretend that that wasn't the case, we had politicians calling for a hotline to report barbaric cultural practices, for example. But in 2016, and I would say that this lines up with the election of Donald Trump, and then subsequently the events in Charlottesville were another sort of key turning point. It shifted, and the attention went to white supremacist, far right extremist. And that's not to say that there is no threat posed by this. I think that they're actually quite dangerous ideologies if you get into it. And it's insidious the way that white supremacy, for example, there are uh, there are hints of it or sense of it within the anti-lockdown, anti-mask, anti-vaccine movement, and it permeates, right? But it in assessing that threat, um, I think that there's maybe an overcorrection or an overcompensation, and probably you referred to white guilt, and I think that that plays a part in this as well, where it's almost cathartic to point to other really bad white people, and I'm going to take it out on them because I'm not like that, and people feel in this push to always have opinions, to opine on stuff, and yeah, it doesn't contribute much to discourse, and it's lazy thinking. At the end of the day, it's lazy thinking by people who probably haven't read a lot of books.
Yeah, to me, what bothers me in this entire episode, and I want to repeat it again, is the entire discourse is very narcissistic and very white centered. I,
Yeah.
I find it very nauseating as a brown person who lives in Canada too now. At least 40% of the time of the year I'm in Canada. So I have earned the right of commenting on Canadian issues because, hey, I also contribute to your economy, Canadians. So you cannot accuse me now. So uh, I find it disturbing because white guilt also makes everything about white people. I
Hmm.
don't I don't give a shit. Listen, you're brown, black, brown, white, whatever color you choose, whatever race, whatever identity. For me, you're all individuals. At the end of the day, I mean, a piece of shit could be a piece of shit as a brown man or a woman or a white man or a woman. My point is, we have pieces of shit everywhere. That's all I'm trying to say. It's not like just because I'm a brown man living in India, we don't have bad people there. We have enough bad people over there too. But the way the discourse and the center of the hate industrial complex that you talk about is narcissism. That's the centrifugal force. To me, as an outsider, when I listened to you, when I read your documents, and then I tried to do the counter, I tried to read the counter to your documents, and everything that tied in this entire episode was narcissism of, on the one side, racists who are
Hmm.
actual white racists, and on
Hmm.
the other side, actual white anti-racists. The narcissism of both these people, and everybody around them is like, I did not sign up for this, guys. So
Yeah,
that's what
no,
I'm
it's
trying to say.
I'm very skeptical of particularly white people, but anyone who makes race their dominant worldview, because it's identity politics, representational politics. That's not going to save us. It's not that's not the solution to this, and it is actually an offensive way to think. Now, again, that's not to say that there aren't systemic issues. And I can speak on the criminal justice system, for example, and the way that certain groups are overrepresented because there is over policing, because of the discretion police apply. There's less indulgences that are granted, right? There, like, we can point to this as a real problem that exists in Canada. But the most recently we had the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, which is now a government holiday. And the effect of that government holiday means that Indigenous people who are in remand or who had court dates, it's now pushed over, right? So like the actual, like this, everyone else gets a holiday, but but what are we doing to address the core issues? And there's an unwillingness to roll up the sleeves and do that dirty work, look at, actually engage with it, because it's much nicer to wave a flag or to, say a few words at the start of your public speech to recognize that you're on unceded territory. Like, and that's not to say performative things have no value. I think symbolism matters. But symbolism isn't substance. And if we replace substance with just this performative stuff, you get to pat yourself on the back while you're still standing on someone's neck.
Yeah, can I back you up on this? Nothing gets me when I hear a bunch of white people. This company and this land was bought from this tribe. We just want to acknowledge this. I was like, are you giving it back to them? If you're
That's right.
not,
That's right.
shut the hell up. This is their way of saying, listen, we told you we did something bad. Now shut up and let us do our work. This is what they're doing. They're just saying it in a nice way. And for my Indian folks, again, Canadian politics is very performative, guys. So try and understand. As someone, again, I have an outsider perspective, but I observe Canadian politics with a lot of interest. There is a veneer of performative, acts on the Canadian politics. And the current Prime Minister of Canada, I don't care if you vote for them, people, Canadians, he is the performative in charge. He is the epitome of performative politics. Like the tweets he writes, the amount of alphabets in his tweets, like what is your contribution to the world, and he will just say some absurd word salad that means nothing. And this is the essence of Canadian politics, being performative, being like, we're not a military superpower. We outsource our fighting capabilities to America. I'm sorry, Canadians, this is a fact. You may not like it. This is a fact. You did that deal with America. I did not. So go fight with your politicians. We don't have any hard power. So what are we going to do? Well, our soft power is we're nice and performative. It is performative. It is very annoying for a person who sits outside and sees. But enough of the serious stuff. I see WWE behind you. Now let's talk about WWE. But before that, I want to ask this question because a live viewer has asked this question. I think it's a good question before we jump into WWE. Now somebody has asked, on a scale of 1 to 10, how corrupt and abusive is the RCMP and Canadian police now? What is the executive and legislative oversight over them? And are there any reforms in the pipeline in the form of proposals?
I think, like most policing systems, there's endless calls for reform. There's endless reports and commissions pointing to issues that, ultimately get shelved, or maybe there are some changes made, but the core remains the same. We do have the notion of a separation of powers So the oversight over RCMP, strictly speaking, the government is not supposed to give direction, right? The RCMP is meant to be an independent entity and not take direction from politicians. Practically speaking, that's a little bit of a separate matter, but often behind closed doors. On a scale of 1 to 10, it's hard because the scales are all relative, right? No one is being, as far as I'm aware, taken off the street in an unmarked van and shot in the back of the head. That's not happening in Canada. But there is absolutely corruption, and our own commissions and overseeing bodies are pointing to that. So I don't know that I can pin us on this because I don't know what the 10, what the 10 represents.
Oh, the Indian 10 is all dangerous. So I don't think so. The Canadians will be at that level. I can assure you
Yeah,
that.
no. So it's not like it's all relative, but it's not good if we put it that way.
Yep. So I understand. Now I saw your pictures with Edge while I was doing my research. Now, what's with you and WWE? When did you get into WWE?
I've been a fan of professional wrestling probably since before I could walk.
Wow.
It was the Saturday night viewing in our household. So my dad liked it, my mom liked it, and I just kind of grew up watching it. And I've always appreciated the spectacle, the drama, the performances, yes, but I also, it's become almost a frame of reference to understand politics. The idea of behind the scenes, actually, they're friendly, right? And they have to get along, and there's this civility, but sometimes not. But there's a show that they have to put on in the House of Commons, and that's what we get to watch, where they're all kind of raucous and acting and performing. And I'm a fan not just of WWE. I now watch AEW as well, and it's a broader kind of. I'll go to an indie show and just enjoy without knowing anything about the storylines or the performers. It's a fun subculture, and one that is quite often mocked. I get a lot of flack for being a wrestling fan, but I think it's people who don't appreciate the art that goes into it. It is performance, and there's athleticism, and I'm a fan. What can I say?
Now, so here's the thing. Obviously, I grew up watching a lot of Hulk Hogan. I still have a VHS tape of WrestleMania 1 in my house. I still do. I have a VHS tape of WrestleMania 4 too. Uh, and SummerSlam. I have the one of my vivid memories is the Ultimate Warrior versus Hulk Hogan match. That I remember till this day. I was a huge Ultimate Warrior fan. Till this day, I don't understand a word he said. I don't understand what he used to say. Like, I would not get it. What the hell was he saying? I would not understand. But it sounded nice. That's all I can say.
It
That's
was
all I can
pleasant.
say.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was fun. But then, the Attitude Era came. I loved the Attitude Era. That was the best. But then they made it for kids, like PG-7. And honestly, like, eh, I don't like it now. I just can't watch it.
There's been a movement away from the PG era. So, it kind of transitions. And of course, there's nostalgia when you think about what you used to watch. It's wrapped into everything else, right? About childhood. So it'll never be as good as we remember it being. Although, objectively, at that time, people were complaining that it wasn't as good as it used to be, which is probably a universal phenomenon. But now, with some of the performances and with wrestlers being of the age where they grew up in the Attitude Era, you see hints of that returning. So, I don't tune in on a weekly basis. I sort of keep up here and there. Twitter has made it a lot easier to get the highlights and the snapshots. But for me, there's nothing better than a live wrestling show, whatever the production. Love it.
So you're more someone who I would categorize as who enjoys the spectacle live, not more on the television. And I think that a lot of people like. I have obviously, I used to love WWE, and then I just moved on to Ultimate Fighting Championship, and I'm more into mixed martial arts now. I enjoy, and but it's just by pure coincidence that my favorite mixed martial artist is, in my view, the greatest Canadian sportsman ever. I rate him higher than Wayne Gretzky. It's George St. Pierre. In my opinion, Canadians will never agree with me, and I understand that. But I think GSP is just, he epitomizes everything that is nice about Canada. He just keeps smiling all the time, and yet he can crack a punch. And I just loved that thing about GSP. He was just amazing. But so what do you make of wrestling today? Because now with the new deal, Vince has pretty much sold the company, and he's left WWE, and now you have UFC and WWE, very interestingly, under the same banner. I think it's Endeavor that owns both UFC and WWE, or has a huge chunk of both of that. So what do you think of this? Like, do you think UFC is going to affect WWE and vice versa, and is going to make both the products better?
We've seen like limited crossover in the past, so it's not a totally alien notion that wrestlers also compete in UFC or vice versa. I think that, yes, my hope, I suppose, is that they're very different products and they appeal to different fan bases, although there's some overlap. I hope that it's not a streamlining that we end up seeing where everything looks kind of similar. I hope that they manage to keep it two distinct products. But the way things are going in the wrestling industry more broadly, there's more competition today than there was, a decade or so ago. And if you remember, like the Monday Night Wars between WCW and WWF at the time, we're back where there's competing production companies that are also offering great product, giving wrestlers more leverage to negotiate for better contracts and, more creative control. And I think that that's a positive overall for the fans. So I'm actually quite hopeful. I don't like to see any kind of oligopoly or monopoly, which is what happened for quite some time, with the shutdown of WCW and ECW. And now that there's more options, I like that in a free market.
Do you have strong opinions as a Canadian about the Montreal screw job till date?
What a shame. What a shame. I appreciate Vince McMahon's perspective that Brett screwed Brett, in that, he should have conceded that he was going to have to lose since he was leaving the company. That only makes sense. But, the level of disrespect, I'm a Bret Hart fan. So I ultimately, at the end of and I was there actually, Elimination Chamber was in Montreal this year. Not for the screw job. I was there this year where Montreal native Sami Zayn was facing off against Roman Reigns for the title. And he had so much momentum, and I was maybe silly to be optimistic that we would right the previous wrong. He ended up losing, but that's part of the drama, right? You have these moments, and that's what WWE does. It creates moments, and I enjoy that. It's markers in your life,
So who do you think is the greatest Canadian professional pro wrestler?
Objectively speaking, Bret Hart is unmatched. But my personal favorite is Chris Jericho. I think that he is the master of reinventing himself, of staying relevant, of, putting his fingers in different pots and succeeding along the way, whether it's with podcasting or writing or his music. And he's funny. I have to separate him as a performer from him as a person. I think that's the case for most wrestlers. Actually, they're a problematic bunch of people. But Chris Jericho to me is my number one guy.
So is Edge back? I mean, I don't understand. Like, is he back or not back? Because he takes such long breaks.
So he was out for a long time, and we didn't think that he would be coming back because of this very serious injury. But he spent a decade or so doing the rehabilitation, obviously doing other stuff as well. He was acting, but he came back to the WWE. I want to say in 2020. Maybe 2019, he returned, and then wrestling. He started wrestling again in 2020. And his contract there is finished. I was actually there for the last match in Toronto. I was bawling, and there's a very unflattering video of me doing that. And now he has joined that AEW, so like the competing company to WWE, much smaller in scale, but is still a viable competitor in some respects. And he is now facing off against Christian Cage. So his former tag team partner, Christian, has been having an amazing heel run in AEW. So we get to have this foil good guy, bad guy with Edge and Christian. And just the photo that you would have seen in your thorough research, I commend you for that. It was a show in Ottawa, and we spent time in the gas station right next to the arena afterwards, just waiting for Uber prices to go down, if I'm being perfectly honest. And it took a while, but lo and behold, Edge walks in with Beth Phoenix, and they're like shopping for Doritos or whatever, like their snacks to drive to their next venue. And they were gracious enough to stand for a picture with me. So that was, it's nerdy, but I have fun with it.
No, I understand. I even actually looked up your satire. I was checking. So you're doing great work, and I have to commend you. I understand you also are quote unquote infamous for having a lot of ordeal with the law enforcement agencies also. So I was thorough in my research, and I have today you're pushing the right buttons there, Caryma. So before we wrap today's podcast up, anything else you want to talk about or mention? I'll give it over to you now.
Well, just kind of an offshoot of Hategate is that the organization that's at the nexus of the misleading information spread by law enforcement and government officials and media, they're currently actively seeking $5 million from the federal government to become an anti-hate watchdog. And their track record is very troubling, because it's a focus on civilians, and to some degree politicians, but it's largely on relatively insignificant people. And I think that this is real cause for concern, because if we have an agency that's effectively acting as a proxy for the ruling party to smear opponents, potential opponents, kind of cut people off at the knees, it's not healthy for a democracy. And the ways that we think about combating hate have to change, because I'll say it again, the cure for bad speech is better speech. And I recognize that in a digital world, we face unique challenges, what with algorithms and the clickbait incentive. You make money by being outrageous, by being less nuanced. So there are all these forces that drive us away from a measured, sensible take on things. But it's now that we have to resist, because happening in parallel, we have the Canadian government looking to regulate the internet and the content that goes on the internet, rather than perhaps thinking about anonymity online and how anonymity is a driver of misinformation, disinformation, harm. So these are still very active issues, and there are ways for people to get involved and, you know, participate by having sort of your voice heard. And it's a limited, you know, your vote is one thing, emailing an MP, right? Like, how useful is it? I say that in order to prevent, you know, to be able to say that you've done kind of what you can, like, we're at a critical juncture. So I would just encourage people to continue looking up these issues. You know, Bill C11, Bill C18, just to understand the landscape, because it matters. And the more, you know, political winds shift, and it's very short sighted for those who are currently in power to say, well, you know, this is what we need to do because we only want good things on the internet. Once that pendulum swings, and you have a different ruling party in power, you bet that the people who pushed for these regulations are not going to be happy about it. And democracy, as imperfect as it is, ultimately is compromise, right? And being able to coexist even when we dislike each other, even when we detest each other, but we work within a framework that everyone gets certain rights. And, you know, we compromise that at our own peril. So that's my preachy-ish kind of closing there, that the issues are active and ongoing, and they affect all of us, whether, or like, I never imagined that I'd be in this position of uh, being targeted by that kind of organization, but it's happening. So, you know, no one is safe in that sense. So just stay vigilant is my closing remark.
No, I'm really grateful to you to come on the podcast and explain this issue because, like I said, there is a significant listener base of this podcast. That is obviously most of them must be Indian origin folks. I'm not going to deny that, but they are Canadian passport holders. They vote in Canada. They have a existence in Canada, and one of my criticisms of the Indian community, which they don't like to hear, has been their frog in the well mentality. You know, they watch more Indian news than Canadian news, and I find it very irritating. Like when I ask them questions about Canadian politics, and they're like, "Why is he asking questions?" and they don't have answers at times. And I always tell them, you know, you're here, be more in tune. And I'm glad you came over on the podcast. So to all my Canadian listeners, this affects you the most. Pay attention. This is not good. You know, stop watching Republic and Times Now for a change and start listening to what's happening in Canada too. This is not good. Authoritarianism sucks of any kind, whether it's left wing authoritarianism or right wing authoritarianism. You should be principally opposed to authoritarianism. It doesn't matter where it comes from. It can come from religion. Nobody needs to convince Kushal Mehra on criticism of religion. I'm the known critic of religion going around, but government can screw you as much as religious institutions can. So you have to be skeptical of everything, guys. But once again, Caryma, thank you very much for coming, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much.
All right, guys, we'll wrap it up. So, to the ones listening to the audio version or the ones who are watching this or going to watch this later on YouTube, in the description of the podcast, you'll have Karima's Twitter handle or her website. Go check her workout. The satire is amazing. I would really, urge all of you to go check her cartoons out. It was really interesting. I really loved that. And as you guys know, I get offered ad reads for these podcasts. I don't do them out of principle because the moment you start doing ads, they control what you can say, how you think, whom do you talk to. Then they tell you, oh, Kushal, you cannot criticize religion because, you know, India is a very religiously sensitive society, which is why I don't do ad reads and I reject a lot of money. So, how do I sustain myself? I sustain myself through a membership program. So please, if you can support this podcast of this crazy person who has heterodox views, please go and become a member, whether on YouTube or on Patreon or for Indians on Fanmo. That's the only way I sustain this podcast, and I've been able to till now. So I hope more and more people join that. If you cannot do that, just leave a rating if you're an audio listener, or on YouTube. I'll see you guys next time. Until then, take care. Namaste. Bye.